You recall that discussion yesterday?
I recall the discussion.
Now, I'm asking you, so this is the objective to supplement what you call poor data here with data out of the results of applying your model. Your model is a pursuit of data. That's what I seem to understand from your evidence today.
Our model is a model which is based on the best estimates of the data we have. That is what the model is based on.
Let me understand.
Data is not perfect, and even for alcohol and tobacco, we don't have perfect data.
But why do we need to estimate data we have? You either have data or you don't. You don't need to estimate it, surely.
But we don't have data on all the 16 parameters of our.
Indeed. So it's data on your parameters.
Yes, on those parameters. All those parameters.
Not on the drugs themselves.
So each of those parameters relates to a potential harm of each drug. So one looks at the data that one has, and for each of those 16 variables, and estimates the relative harm on that axis of each drug.
Professor, back at page 19, or slide 19, I put to you that those are not the results of data, those are the results of a weighing process by your so-called experts.
Yeah, that is the final result.
Yeah, it's the result of a weighing.
The data, yes, the data plus weights, yes.
Well, it's not data. This is a subjective outcome.
Well, that is the nature of the MCDA. It's about determining the value of different criteria in terms of making decisions. That is the purpose of the exercise.
That's my point. This is not data. These are subjective results. The weighing, possibly, of data, but this is weighing.
Well, these are the weighted data, yes. The
or weighting.
The unweighted data is available.
So what was the data that was weighted? What do you call the data?
So the first set of data is the process of estimating the rankings on the 16 parameters of harm. So I gave you a couple of examples here. So here on page 10, here are two of the parameters, two of the criteria. And what you see for those two measures, which are on the left drug-specific mortality and on the right drug-related mortality, these are the expert rankings of the 20 drugs on those criteria. And that was done across all 16 parameters.
So that is data that was created in the process.
That is new data created by the process. Yes.
So it's data that comes as a result of applying a process with the experts.
Correct.
Self-created data.
No, it's the best estimates of data, not self-created data.
Okay. Let me go with your best estimates, but they are subjectively estimated by people from different...
They are estimates. They are estimates.
But they are subjective.
No, it depends what you mean by subjective.
Well, I'll tell you what I mean by subjective. Data is objective. It can be objectively verified. Your subjective data here cannot be verified except by those who express opinion.
But the point, as I've made many times, is that for some of these we don't have objective data, but where we do, we use it. And I gave you an example here on page 12 of the objective data, the comparative toxicology of alcohol, heroin, and cannabis. So where there is good data, we use it. Where there is less good data, we make an expert judgment. That is the way one has to progress this field.
So, all of your experts are people from the United Kingdom, first world country, first world city mostly, and you expressed that methamphetamine had a very low score because of its limited use. Alcohol and others would be higher because of their use. So in parts of the world where methamphetamine are abused more so, we're going to find that methamphetamines will be located elsewhere on your graft.
Yes, so it's, as I say, it's very, very likely, I would imagine almost certain, that in countries where there is a massive methamphetamine problem, that the red bars, the harm of methamphetamine to the society, would go up. That is intuitively correct. The actual score of methamphetamine to the user may not change, or it might change, depending on how it was used. If cultures had a very more dangerous way of using methamphetamine, then the score to the user might go up as well. But so we take into account both those factors, societal harm and personal harm.
You accept cannabis as an addictive drug?
Cannabis does cause dependence, that is true.
Yet your scores that I asked you to describe on those 16 criteria rank cannabis at best relatively harmless.
On dependence, you asked me how dependence-producing it was, and I gave you the comparison between tobacco, which we believe produces dependence in about 40% of people who use it, maybe more. Heroin, about 35%. Cocaine, about 25%. Alcohol, about 15%. Cannabis, I think we've all agreed, you've presented data where it's about between 8 and 10%. So it is less dependence-producing than other drugs, and more than some.
Tell me, heroin is heroin the dangerous drug that we all believe it to be?
Well, heroin in my country is responsible for about 2,000 deaths a year, alcohol for maybe 20,000, and tobacco for about 80,000. So heroin is dangerous. So that's one measure. Then, I mean, it depends how you mean. Which of the criteria of harm are you thinking of?
Professor, you cannot think of drugs without comparing them to another drug, it appears.
Well, you asked, is heroin harmful? What do you mean by harmful? Does it affect people's life expectancy? Does it affect their respiration? Does it affect their cognitive? What do you mean by harmful? This is the whole point of having the 16 parameters of harm, because if you ask me about any of those, I could then go and give you an estimate of the harms of heroin.
Professor, you cannot isolate a drug, whether it be cannabis or heroin, and talk about it without referencing alcohol or tobacco. Is that correct?
Of course, I can talk to you about the absolute harms of any particular drug. If there is data, I will do my best to analyse it and present it with you.
And so is your evidence there's no absolute data in regard to cannabis?
Well, we have data, or we have discussed the data on dependence. The data suggests about up to 10% of users become dependent. That is data.
Is that your answer to the question?
There is data showing that very few people die from using cannabis. I mean, the point is, the harms are varied, and that's why we have this 16-point scale, because it allows us to interrogate, to answer your question across the different harms.
Let's have a look at your slide 19 again. Crack cocaine is at 54.
Yes.
And cocaine is at 27.
Correct.
it would appear that there's more case to be made out for the banning of crack, but the allowing of cocaine and anything in between, such as methamphetamine. Your comment on that?
Well, in the value of these data are to help decision makers estimate the need for intervention. And if you were to decide in a country that the appropriate threshold was to be set at methamphetamine, then things less harmful than methamphetamine could be legal. It would be a bizarre threshold to set, but you could.
What was the tobacco mortality rated at? 90?
So tobacco mortality, if you go to slide 10, this illustrates the two forms of mortality. Well, two of the forms of the two mortality criteria we used.
Yes, yours. Yes.
So on the left-hand side, slide 10, you're on. Tobacco, when used in the normal fashion, has zero mortality. It does not kill people. The smoking of a cigarette, I don't believe, has been known, a single cigarette has been known to kill anyone. But on the right-hand side, the chronic use of tobacco leads to mortality that is scored at 90, because it is very, very likely that people who smoke chronically will end up dying of a tobacco-related disorder.
Now, tobacco is smoked typically by way of, your example, one cigarette. So that's one's first cigarette smoked. I think some people might even feel nauseous. Each of these drugs is at first consumed in probably some sort of a standard unit, like a cigarette is in a cigarette. Correct?
Correct. Yes.
Do any of these drugs kill anybody at first use?
Well, that's why heroin is 100, because heroin is 100 because that is the drug that is most likely to kill someone, not just at first use, but at any individual application of the drug. And heroin, there was always this risk that any time you use it, particularly if you inject it, which is common, you will die. And
you could die.
15% of anyone who's ever used heroin will die as a consequence of respiratory depression from injecting.
Say that I'm not quite understanding.
So our estimate is that in heroin users, about 15% of people who use heroin die as a result of the heroin itself, not of AIDS or of Hep C. They die because heroin is a very dangerous drug when it's injected, and it stops people breathing. So it has a high score on the drug-specific mortality.
And then we look at alcohol. At 50, half of heroin?
That's the estimate. So the evidence for that comes on the next two slides, where...
No, just...
Yes, because the mortality, in Britain, 3 young people a week die of alcohol poisoning. They just go out, get drunk, and die. The ratio between a heavy intoxicating dose of alcohol and a lethal dose of alcohol is about 2. So that means alcohol is quite a dangerous drug.
But any drug that one overdoses on this list could kill you, except tobacco. You can't overdose on tobacco. You'll get sick before you...
Well, it's the same for cannabis. I don't think anyone's had an overdose death on cannabis.
Do you have data for that? Have you?
Well, the data is on slides.
Do you have any scientific research that demonstrates that fact?
Well, there aren't. We don't have reported cases of overdose deaths on cannabis through our forensic science service. So that is data.
I saw you. Well, I pointed you to the incident of the child that ended up in ICU.
Yeah.
I saw that the plaintiffs commented on that, and I think they alluded to some evidence you would have given that all they should have done is given the child some condensed milk. Was that your
What?
Okay, I can see from your answer that you were not partisan to that. Let me leave that there. There's no research that proves that you can't overdose on cannabis, Professor.
Well,
for obvious reasons, of course.
Well, there is. I mean, the point is, we have these margins of exposure estimates, which do give us some confidence that cannabis is much less likely to harm you than alcohol. So there is research. There is research on the toxicology of cannabis in animals. There is not a lot of research, because it's unethical to look at the toxicology of cannabis in humans, but what we do know is that people, even if they do overdose and become quite ill, they don't die. So it's less likely to kill you in overdose than alcohol or heroin. I don't think that's contestable.
No, it's the way you rate it, and it's the message you attempt to convey that's disputed.
No, this is not about conveying messages. This is about getting the best estimates of harm.
So that's all they are, estimates. These are not facts.
They are the best estimates of comparative harms of drugs that exist in the world today.
A hypothesis.
And as the nature of science is that people do experiments. This is a kind of experiment. They present the data, and then other scientists come along and try to refute it. And if they refute it, then the hypothesis is wrong. We have to go back and rethink. But at present, this paper has been cited over 800 times. I think you managed to find the 2 citations which were a bit critical. And I think this is generally accepted as being the gold standard at present of how we assess the harms of drugs. And one of the papers you provided to me yesterday in Bundle 13 made a comment. Could I read that, please?
Judge, Professor, as a scientist, if one is to... we've read and we heard from what Measham and Rolls had to say in relation to policy making and even the difficulties of using your model in policy making. We read that yesterday. But as a scientist, one ultimately wants to conduct research with controls in place, with parameters, specific objectives. Of course, if we could use human beings rather than animals. And one wants to produce results from data, or that instead of just being opinion or hypothesis, will be data. Would you agree with that statement?
In the ideal world, yes, we would have absolute data on everything, but we don't live in the ideal world, and we never will.
I'm just looking to find... I thought I saw... Just bear with me. In the United States, most of the deaths that are occurring there now, I believe you know, are caused from fentanyl.
I believe there's a strong relationship. I think most of the heroin deaths have fentanyl present. I don't think it's just fentanyl itself.
Well, it's an opioid crisis, as you've conceded. And currently that is considered to be the deadliest drug in the USA.
Well, it's killing more people than cannabis, certainly. Yeah.
Is fentanyl on your list here?
No, fentanyl is not on this list. We have done a subsequent analysis of comparative harms of opioids, and fentanyl does score very highly.
Now, in your model, in your exercise, the most dangerous drug there was heroin. and scored at 100.
Correct, yes.
So in America, it would be fentanyl, predominantly amongst their experts and their views on what's affecting their society.
Yeah, I think fentanyl probably would be the number one now, yes. In America. It's a more dangerous drug than heroin in the sense that it's harder to dose safely.
So, you're aware of the Robbins study on the returning Vietnam veterans?
Yes, I am.
It showed that 20% of Vietnam soldiers sent to Vietnam that came back addicted to heroin, only 5% remained addicted in the United States. That's, in essence, the outcome of that study.
Correct.
Which meant that 95% of those people that were considered to be addicted did not maintain their addiction. Correct? And
well, wait, I mean, whether they were addicted, but they were certainly using, yeah.
That comes back to somewhat of a corollary, which is that one needs to understand, under addiction, the effect of environmental factors.
Oh, environmental factors have a huge impact on addiction. That is why, as I said, the estimates are made, at least where we have done it, for a country or in the case of Europe, a continent. That sort of material data isn't quantified into the results of this model. Now, what would you would have? Yes or no? The addictiveness of heroin. Is that information quantified into this model, Professor? The information that there is an environmental impact on addictiveness. It's not. The addictiveness in this model is for Britain. If we had done the model in Vietnam and then done the model in the USA after Vietnam on that population, then I'm sure the model would have been able to accommodate the change in addictiveness, or use at least, because of the environmental influence. No one disputes the environment has an impact. If the criticisms of the various aggregation criticisms would be taken into account, and what I put to you yesterday as being the illogical comparison between alcohol and tobacco against something like cannabis was taken into account, if that was possible in the model, one would get totally different results. I'm afraid you've lost me. So if the criticisms, which I've just alluded, aggregation criticisms, the argument that it's illogical to compare a drug like alcohol or tobacco used by so many to drugs used by so few, if those criticisms were taken into account and your model was adapted, you'd get different results here. Well, the results would change almost certainly, with different levels of use. That is true. The reality is, in the UK, cannabis use is as high as tobacco use, so they're pretty equivalent, and they're about half that of alcohol use. So there we have drugs which are at least used quite widely. Your 16, the MCDA criteria, those would not be the same criteria that one would use in South Africa, would they, necessarily? Oh, they would. They would? Yeah, it'd be hard. I mean, because they encompass all the possible harms. That's the whole point about them, that they encompass all the harms that we were able to consider. This was a serious process of evaluating the harms of drugs. I mean, if there are harms that are specific to South Africa, they could also go into the model. That this model is not exclusive, but let me put it to you on another basis. Based on what you've answered, South African experts could sit down and come up with 28 different criteria, not just 16. No, they couldn't. On what? Because well, they could, but they would probably not be. Those would not very unlikely to be accepted as being independent. What we have tried to do here is create discrete, independent variables. I'd be very surprised if there were 12 extra independent variables in South Africa. That would seem to me almost implausible.
Let's assume, hypothetically, Professor, they did come up with 28 criteria, including your 16. The results, you don't know what the results would be, do you?
Wouldn't know. You'd have to do this.
No.
But what I do know is we want to look very critically at where those extra 12 came from and whether they were just replications of some of the 16 we have at present.
Why would you want to look at that, Professor? Because you want the results to look the same as your own model?
I have said many times, this is the state of the art. If South African experts want to improve on it, then they will, by all means. It would be wonderful to improve on it. If they really believe there are extra dimensions or parameters of harm that are special to South Africa, or we've missed some, let them come up. Let us have a dialogue. Publish the paper. Let's have a refereed dialogue.
Could you go to file 13, page 428? Professor, these 16 criteria are not your criteria. They're the criteria of the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs. Yes or no?
Yes, they are.
You're not part of that Advisory Council and haven't been so since 2009 November. Correct?
That is correct.
Let's go to page 431, please. This, for the record, is a document titled ACMD, Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs, Consideration of the Use of Multi-Criteria Decision Analysis in Drug Harm Decision Making, produced by that committee itself. If you were not party to this document when it was drafted, I see, because your name does not appear at pages 444 and 445, being the members of the council at the time.
Yes, that's correct.
The first, on page 430, the first few paragraphs or first two paragraphs deal with the council. The third paragraph, the purpose of the work in this report is to improve the framework for providing advice to ministers on the harms of drugs. The ACMD considered that this work would not seek to update or revisit the present classification system on drugs, but would serve as a tool to augment ACMD's deliberations and judgments in this challenging field. Next paragraph. In this report, the ACMD considered the use of multi-criteria decision analysis, MCDA, to support the process of developing a framework. MCDA is often used in such situations where decision makers need to derive a transparent outcome, but in an environment where there may be many and sometimes conflicting evaluations. The technique of MCDA aims to address these conflicts and derive a compromise. The process is based on developing a list of criteria and using evidence formulating judgments and then preferences to derive an outcome. The process is therefore subjective, and different users of the model may derive different outcomes on the same evidence dependent on their preferences, although the importance of different preferences can be tested through sensitivity analyses. However, using MCDA increases transparency by allowing others to see the process by which decisions have been derived. The key part of the model is the development of criteria that express the ways in which substances can be harmful, which comprise of physical, psychological, and social harms. I want to read the last sentence again. The key part to the model is the development of criteria that express the ways in which substances can be harmful. That is at odds with the answers you gave to my questions preceding me taking you to this document, Professor.
Sorry, it's not at all at odds. that we used in our analysis these criteria. These are the criteria
Yes.
that the ACMD developed.
The last question, Professor, to focus you. The key part of the model is the development of criteria. You said no, those are the 16 criteria.
Sorry,
That's them.
these are the criteria that this report came up with from the decision conference it hosted, and these are the ones we used. So we just took the ACMD criteria because they had done the work, and we used it in our subsequent analysis. These are their criteria. We used their criteria.
Your evidence preceding me taking you to this document was that the criteria are those 16. No more, no less.
No. What I said was if there were other criteria, they'd have to be tested to see whether they were truly independent of those 16.
I don't want to argue with you, Professor. The record will speak for itself. Page 441, please.
441.
441. The document then works through various assumptions, and at the last paragraph on 441 says the following. The ACMD recognizes the need for further external development of the model and for research that can test the underlying assumptions. The ACMD welcomes such further research on this initial study to consider the next steps on how best to employ such tools in the context of providing advice, not data. Do you want to pass any comment on that? You agree with it?
Well, that's precisely why we went on and did our study, and the European study, and the other studies we've done since. Yes, absolutely. Because we do need to progress this.
Multi-criteria decision analysis as a tool. You have considered the actual analyses as a tool on its own, used, in other words, just as an analysis. You've looked at that before, Professor? I'll test that to see whether you have or haven't, maybe. There are 5 components to an MCDA, a multi-criteria decision analysis. One is the goal. One must know what it wants to achieve. Then there's the decision maker or group of decision makers with opinions and preferences. You agree to that?
Mm-hmm.
Then there are decision alternatives. Then there's evaluation criteria, which is really the interests that are being pursued. And then one arrives at outcomes or consequences associated with the alternative interest combinations. You obviously defined your decision as being, what was your goal when you set about applying the MCDA?
It's in the Lancet paper. So, if you want to be precise.
Well, that's your work. Do you not remember what your goal was?
Well, the goal was to do a comparative assessment of those 20 drugs according to the 16 criteria that the ACMD had developed.
Your document is found at 164 in file 2.
Or is this 2? Maybe this is 2. This is 13. Okay, I have it. Which page?
164.
Yes.
Your summary at the top and the background is, and it appears to be what your goal was, a proper assessment of the harms caused by the misuse of drugs.
Yes.
Professor, might I just say this to you? I'm not criticizing an effort to be of assistance to policymakers in your country. Calkins and Fiona
Measham.
Rolls and Measham criticized the model, and others, which you're aware of. My point is that your results can't be applied and ought not to be applied as set out in your summary of evidence to South Africa. You understand? I
understand what you're saying.
You just need to know where I'm coming from. I'm not really asking. You don't need a comment. It's a point of clarification. You set out to make a proper assessment. That was your goal. You then had a decision maker or group of decision makers with opinions. It appears that the majority of them came from your so-called independent drug committee.
Correct.
The decision alternatives, I can't identify what the decision alternatives were because everything was predetermined. They were given the criteria they were to use, firstly, and secondly, they were merely told to weight it.
No. There was a two-point process. The first was the scaling, and the second was the weighting. They're independent.
All the scaling and then the weighting. Mm-hmm. But that's all they had to do. They weren't really alternatives.
They had to agree that the 16 parameters that the ACND had come up with were the appropriate ones to use, and they did.
So, any group of specialists of in different disciplines would have to agree on the criteria. They were not bound to your criteria.
No, if they thought there were other criteria that, as I say, were independent, then they could use those, yes.
But I thought, I honestly understood your evidence earlier, Professor, to be that those are the 16 criteria. Well, not 17, not 28, not 15.
No one has ever come up with others, so I presume most people in the world who are interested in this topic think they're right.
Well, maybe that's... Professor, that wasn't your answer earlier, that nobody else has come up with others. Your answer earlier was quite categorical, that these are the 16.
I believe they are the 16.
Then one has the evaluation. Well, in fact, that's the fourth step is the evaluation of criteria. Do we want to keep it? Don't we want to keep it? How do we scale it?
No, so you have to... There have been subsequent MCDAs we have done where we have, for instance, when we looked at tobacco products, where two criteria were deleted because they weren't relevant to tobacco, because tobacco did not impact on those criteria. So it's possible to adjust the number of criteria according to whether it's meaningful to have that particular criterion in.
It's the fifth. It appears that you determined the goal, you determined the group of, and this you may have done with or without the media, I don't know. And of course this may have, I don't know whether this was together with King, who also then wrote together with you.
Would you like to know the origins of this?
No. Listen to my question.
It might help you because you're assuming you do know.
I don't.
You don't know the origins of this. Shall I tell you the origins of this?
I don't want to know the origins of this, Professor. Please answer my question.
Well, what was the question?
You decided the goal, did you?
Who's you?
You, Professor Nutt?
No.
Who did you provide?
The group decided the goals.
The group that came together?
Yes.
Who decided on the group that came together?
The ISCD, the Independent Scientific Committee on Drugs, decided on the group.
Were they all included? Was everybody on the committee included?
I don't believe everyone came to the meeting, no.
So was it an open invitation?
To all my members, yes.
So it was an invitation to all your members to join on a particular occasion for a particular purpose, the details of which would be discussed on the night before.
No, they were aware that this process was going on, because one thing you need to realise that I believe several of the people in my group were also party to the ACMD report. In fact, so was I.
Yes.
The reason my name is not on the ACMD report was because, having conducted the original research, or at least no, in fact I did. It was as chair of the ACMD, I initiated the process of developing the criteria using Larry Phillips. So that was one of my last tasks as chair of the ACMD.
Professor, you are not...
So I was part of the group that did the research to find the 16 parameters. I'm not on the final report because I'd left the ACMD at that point.
The idea seems to have been that of the ACMD in previous years, as far back as 2007 already.
Well, that is correct.
2002.
Because I was working on the ACMD all that time. This was a vision of transparency which was endorsed by the ACMD.
You were part of the ACMD, we do accept that. The decision alternatives, who decided on those?
The group decides on those.
And the evaluation criteria?
The group decides on them.
Now, and I understand from what you've told us that the outcomes or consequences associated with the alternative interest combinations, that obviously came out of the two-stage process. Now, the basis on which you made your decisions, you explained to us, was that by way of the Delphi or Delphic method.
Correct.
Delphic methods are ordinarily used to forecast decisions, correct?
They do have a role in forecasting, yes, yes, they're useful in areas where you don't know what's going to happen, so you get your best experts together to give you their estimates.
Let me read you what I found on the Delphi method. My research on the Delphi method in relation to medicine is the following: the polling of experts in a field to reach consensus, make decisions or disseminate knowledge. Individual specialists are organized in a virtual group, one that does not meet face-to-face in one place. They're each given a standard set of questions to answer or review. Their responses are tallied by the group's organizers, and then the preliminary data analysis is shared with all members of the group for further comments and revisions. A final report summarizing the opinions of the group is drafted. The Delphi method is one means of publishing criteria for standards of care or the state of the art of a particular discipline in healthcare. That is, whether that's correct or not, for the moment, that is not what you did.
No, because the MCA doesn't do that. The MCA is a refinement of the Delphic method. So the Delphic process...
You're referring to the OC?
The MCDA.
MCDA.
MCDA is the state-of-the-art for Delphic processing, as I understand it, in that not only do you use experts to gather the best knowledge, but also you test them publicly, within the group. You test their opinions, and if people have outlying opinions, you find out what they're based on, whether there's evidence that they know that the others don't. So this is a refinement of the traditional Delphic process to maximize the value.
I found this, by the way, in the medical dictionary. It's also found in Encyclopedia, if one searches there, what I've just read to you. My point is that what you did is not what I just read out to you, because there everybody worked together. There was no anonymity.
Well, you read out...
Yes, it's a yes or no answer, Professor.
This is a different form of Delphic process.
That may be so. Is that your answer then?
This is a refinement of a Delphic process. Yes. This is a highly established technology, MCDA.
I am very wary of using Wikipedia as a method of understanding something, but sometimes those who contribute to Wikipedia their efforts can be tested by reference to their references. And in this instance, Delphi method is very well researched and well defined under Wikipedia. And there I discovered the following, that Delphi is based on the principle that forecasts or decisions from a structured group of individuals for the sake of being more accurate than those from unstructured groups. The technique can also be adapted for use in face-to-face meetings, and then it's called mini Delphi or estimate talk estimate. It would appear that yours was an estimate talk estimate application of Delphi.
Well, it certainly sounds like it could be, but did you look up MCDA?
Yes, I did. In fact, that's where that's what we discussed a few moments ago, with the 5 steps in an MCDA. Professor, my point is this. You've described what you did. I just want to get clarity that, on record, that what you did, it's not fair and correct to simply refer to MCDA and simply refer to the Delphic process or method. It's more accurate. What is a more accurate approach is to simply look at what you did, which you've described.
What we did, we have described, and remarkably replicated with a remarkable degree of consensus amongst European
experts. And you've adapted techniques to find a technique such as the one set out in your article. You've adapted MCDA and the analyses approach. You've adapted the Delphic process. Conceptually, you've used them, but what it is really is what we read in your article at page 168, your published article, Nutt 2010. Nutt et al. 2010, forgive me. 164, sorry for the record.
Yes. I mean, I think it would be worth putting on the record that I had never heard of MCDA until we published a 2007 Lancet paper, and I was approached by this world expert, Larry Phillips, on MCDA, saying, you've done a reasonable job with your first 9-point scale, you could do better. And he approached me, we approached the Medical Research Council in Britain, and they funded those two processes, the process of generating the 16 parameters of harm, and they supported the development of this analysis for the paper. So this is not something I have invented. I have worked with the world expert in this field, particularly the world expert in relation to drugs and drug harms. Larry Phillips has been employed for a number of years working for the European FDA to help them use MCDA to come to better decisions about pharmaceutical drugs.
We'd love to hear from Mr. Phillips if he's willing to give evidence, but he's not going to give evidence at this juncture. Could you turn to file 13?
Yes.
Page 215. Professor, I want to read the abstract into the record. First, this is an article by Jonathan Calkins, Peter Reuter, and Carolyn Coulson. They hail from United States institutions. Their article is titled Basing Drug Scheduling Decisions on Scientific Ranking of Harmfulness, False Promise and False Premises. The work of the Advisory Council as a whole in coming up with the 16 criteria and your work in adapting this multi-criteria decision analysis in that council was designed specifically around the British scaling ABC.
No, not at all.
Not.
No. It was designed as part of a process which I explained had been attempting to develop over the previous 15 years to come up with an appropriate definition, underpinned, transparent way of assessing drug harms.
I say that because it comes out, and everything, all of this happens in and about the two reports to which we were taken in your evidence in chief. The one that came out in 2002, and then that which came out in 2009.
Relating to cannabis, you mean?
Relating to cannabis, and it being moved from category A to from category B to category C, and then as a result of the decision of the Home Secretary back up to B in 2009. That's why I say that.
No, this process, cannabis was not in no way central to this process. There were many other drugs that we were concerned with: ketamine, GHB, MDMA, to name a few, methamphetamine. These are drugs which the council were concerned about, and it was felt it...
There are only, of all those drugs, out of the 20, 2 of them are legal. Is that correct? Do I miss one? It's alcohol.
Oh, butane's still legal.
It's butane. So 3 of them are legal.
Yeah, well, let me just check.
Well, butane's legal. It's abused, of course.
Anabolic steroids. CAT was legal at the time, so 5 of them were. Anabolic steroids have a kind of ambiguous status. So actually, methadone was legal. So what's 1, 2, 3... At least 5 were legal at the time, I believe.
Of those 5, 2 are used in large numbers in the world. Alcohol at half the world's population, we've discussed.
Quite.
Why not simply leave them? Why not simply an exercise leaving them out, deal with them separately? They fall to be criticized, but they are legal. Why not simply leave them out, Professor?
Well, because the role of the Advisory Council on Issues of Drugs is to advise the government on the harms and the way of dealing with the harms of drugs. And they are drugs.
In this court, you've been called on behalf of the plaintiffs to testify simply about cannabis. One could equally say that you have not been called to testify about alcohol and tobacco.
That is true.
If we go to the Calkins article at 215, and I'll read the extract. In recent years, a number of studies have attempted to rank drugs by a single measure of harmfulness on the basis of decisions about scheduling and classification. These efforts are fundamentally flawed, both conceptually and methodologically. The effort to provide a single measure masks the variety of non-comparable dimensions that are relevant. The fact that benefits are ignored for most, but not all, drugs, and that the harms of a drug are not invariant to the policy regime chosen. Methodologically, the most prominent recent effort ignores drug interactions and mixes aggregate and individual harms inappropriately. So those are the 2 primary criticisms that I put to you earlier, apart from the Rolls and Measham criticisms. I continue in the abstract. Instead, we suggest that multiple dimensions of harm need to be displayed to inform human judgments of what drugs should be scheduled. Harm is not usefully reducible to a single dimension, and even perfect rankings would not constitute a sufficient statistic for determining scheduling decisions. Now, this court case, on the case put before His Lordship on the pleadings, is all about the scheduling of cannabis and then resultant relief that would come out of any adjustments in that scheduling, whether it should or shouldn't be in the schedules. I don't want to spend more time than what's necessary in this document, Professor, but...
Well, could I reply to the Calkins criticism?
Well, that's what I'm going to go through now. I'm going to take
fine.
you to their criticisms and give you that opportunity. In the introduction, they repeat a version of criticism. It's in general terms. And then, under the heading, individual and aggregate level perspectives should not be mingled. Harmfulness to an individual and aggregate harm to society are entirely different concepts. Mingling the two is a common source of faulty reasoning, because harm rankings can be entirely different at the individual versus aggregate unit of analysis. Here's the example. Being hit on the head by a meteorite is highly harmful to the individual, but meteorite strikes are a negligible source of population-level mortality. Similarly, taking cyanide is more harmful to an individual than taking ethanol, but ethanol abuse is a much larger problem for society. The simplest way to distinguish macro and micro level harm is to think of the former as the latter multiplied by the extent of use. Amount of use could have various meanings: prevalence or quantity, weight, consumed or even more refined measures, binges. The distinctions, then, they tell you, are discussed in another article. I think I should stop there and just give you an opportunity to comment.
So, as you probably know, I wrote a commentary deconstructing that argument, and that's available in the bundle we provided to you on page 263, 105. But let me just take you through it. So, yeah, I mean, it's an important critique by some of the leading American researchers in the field of drug and drug policy. No question about that at all. I appreciate the fact that they read it, the paper, and have made an effort to think it through. I would just say a couple of things. The first thing, their criticism that we have conflated dimensions of personal and societal harm is not true. That is why we present the data with both separate sets of harm, so people can clearly see that whether the societal harm versus the individual harm. So they didn't look carefully enough, perhaps. The second point is that if they really want data on every single one of those 16 parameters of harm, that was also in the paper. You can see every drug has got its own individual score for the all. So we did the best we could at disaggregating the data, or showing you how the final data was aggregated from the subsets of data. So
perhaps just for record purposes, the witness should point out which pages he's referring to.
I was just waiting for the witness to finish.
Sorry. So the first point I was making, separating the individual harm from the aggregate harm, is on slide 19. But wait, I think it's also in the paper. Now, why don't we go to the paper? So it's, my lord, it's on page 167. That clearly separates individual...
Volume 2.
Yes, volume 2. There we clearly separate the harm to the user and the harm to society. And I think they should have known that. What they're objecting to is adding them together, I expect. And we come back to that in a minute. The second point is on 169. We have, you can see the composition of every one of those bars. You can see the contribution of each of the 16 variables to the final score for every drug. So the data is there if they wish to look at it.
Well, let's look at what they say about that.
Yes.
If you go to page 216 in the Calkins article, I want to do this in two stages, because they follow. Where I left off in my first reading, which is really the first main paragraph on page 216 in the left-hand column, I'm first going to read from the second paragraph, and then take you more directly to what their point is. They first say the key point is that when national policy is made on utilitarian grounds, the focus is on aggregate outcomes, such as social welfare or total harm. In contrast, the medical, laboratory, or individual user perspective focuses on harm per unit of use, harmfulness, to distinguish it from total aggregate harm.
Sorry, Mr. Willis, where are you reading from?
Sorry, my lord, this is file 13 at 216, my lord.
216. Where on 216?
My lord, for your lordship's benefit, in the left-hand column, the second paragraph ends with the words "not concern us here," I've already read up to there previously, my lord. Or
Yeah, just after that.
then after that. And so I make the first
Yes.
point out of what they say. The key point is that when national policy is made on utilitarian grounds, the focus is on aggregate outcomes, such as social welfare or total harm. In contrast, the medical laboratory or individual user perspective focuses on harm per unit of use. We will call that harmfulness to distinguish it from total or aggregate harm. Crucially, aggregate harm is not simply harmfulness, scaled up to the societal level, because amount of use is not a constant across substances, policies, or circumstances. If you go down to the bottom of the page, the last paragraph starts Nutt et al. And then brackets, square brackets at 12. They say the following: Nutt et al. Considered 16 harm criteria divided into 2 groups. 9 relate to harms to users and 7 harm to others, or harmfulness as they qualified it above. They report and discuss harms on these 16 criteria and the part scores, but for present purposes our concern is their overall harm score, which is a weighted sum, 0.46 harm to users, 0.54 harm to others. So we see that these are relatively close, Professor. In the next paragraph at the top of page 216 on the right, they continue. Nutt et al. Measures the first group on a per-person basis, and the second mainly in terms of aggregate harm. Thus, Nutt et al.'s overall harm scores measure neither harm per unit or use nor aggregate harm, but an awkward weighted average of each. The portion of the overall harm score reflecting harm per unit of use ignores harmfulness to others. Similarly, the portion reflecting aggregate harm ignores harm to users themselves. Thus, when these harm scores are brought into a policy debate, they enforce an implicit assumption that policy can have no effect on harm to users by changing the amount of use. That's a Measham criticism. But here's their point. In conclusion, hiding total harm's dependence on prevalence in this way is analytical malpractice. So we understand what you did, Professor, but this is their criticism of what you did.
So, yeah, well, you have access in this the plaintiff's bundle 263.105, which is my commentary on their critique, and maybe I should read it because I think it gives a fair assessment of what I believe. Would you like that, my lord?
Mr. Willis?
As you wish, Professor. I must give you an opportunity. Where are you reading from?
263.105.
Sorry, 263 point?
105. It's the end of this sort of accessory bundle here, or unless it's all PDF.
It's after the slides, so it's file 2. Lord, you've got that. It's in file 2 at page 263.1. We just need to give our learned friends to my left an opportunity. Are you ready? You there? Thanks. Professor, you wish to refer us on page 263.105?
Yes.
Starting at, would you like me to read it for you?
I would like to read it. And it starts with a quote from Voltaire: "Let not the best be the enemy of the good." The Corkins et al. Paper gives a fair critique of the issues relating to attempts by us and others to develop a comprehensive single scale against which all drugs can be compared. I would not argue with the criticisms of our approach, with their criticisms of our approach. We ourselves pointed out it has a number of flaws. For instance, in the paper that prompted the Corkins et al. Response, we specifically mentioned that factors such as legal status were bound to influence use and harms. We also argued for a more sophisticated analysis in which drug benefits would also be taken into account. However, how one does this is still uncertain. One way would be to develop another list of benefits and plot the scores orthogonal, that's at right angles, to the harm ones. The alternative matrix approach, Calkins et al. Suggests, would to some extent overcome some of the limitations of our approach and provide a more refined analysis. However, it would be very hard to do, which I presume is why they have not done it themselves and presented the outputs. Perhaps a test analysis for one or two drugs would help to clarify the necessary process and the kind of results that might be obtained. If it appeared technically feasible and the results promising, then we and others might well take it up. Indeed, if the results from a more sophisticated matrix approach are ever published, then we would be pleased to use the information it contained in any future drug harms assessment. The second criticism is that a single ranking score is of little value. I would contend that despite its scientific limitations, the composite score that we developed with the two dimensions of harm to self and others, by virtue of its clarity and simplicity, gives a very useful perspective on drug harms. This in itself is a significant improvement on our earlier one-dimensional scale, which nevertheless was beneficial for public health decisions, legal and political thinking, and public education. It should be remembered that all decisions regarding drug classifications resolve harms into a single scale point for each drug, so people, particularly politicians, are used to making and working with such estimations. Our two-dimensional matrix is especially helpful as it clearly separates the harms to self and those to others. This allows the self score to drive interventions for individual benefit, including education and legal controls, while the other scores can inform and hopefully direct policy aimed at reducing the total burden of harms from any drug. Anyone interested in alcohol and other drugs, from law enforcement to education and from health improvement to international policy, needs some measure that allows them to understand and communicate relative harms and risks. I believe we have provided the best current available analysis of an extremely complex, multifaceted data set. It isn't perfect, but nevertheless good enough to be useful, and if it encourages the pursuit of the best, then more to the good.
Professor, when you presented your evidence via your slides, you did two things and you omitted to do something correctly. The first is at slide 9. If you could just leave that file open, if you can go to slide 9. You justified the results by focusing us on drug deaths, particularly in relation to tobacco, alcohol, and opiates. That was convenient because it is true that there's, at the very least, a paucity, if any, information on cannabis just causing a direct death simply through its use once off. You then, at slide 11, focused us further on drug-specific mortality as a criteria when you referenced Lachenmeyer and Ream's margin of exposure method. And then at 12, you took us to your conclusion that by a wide margin, cannabis is the least risky recreational drug. That was your submission to this court. You follow me thus far?
No, that is not my conclusion. That is the slide. This is a way of representing the margin of exposure data from a log scale, which is this scale, to a linear scale, which is this scale. It makes it easier for people to understand the actual variation or the range of toxic ratios.
So what we read at the top of that slide, by a wide margin, cannabis is the least risky recreational drug. Do you mean to say that's not your evidence before this court?
No, this is a picture taken from the Washington Post, and I do not support the conclusion, but I was showing you the image of the comparative ratios of harms of alcohol and cannabis, which I believe is taken from the Latchfire paper.
You then, at slide 13, sought to drive home the point in relation to drug-related harms that alcohol is much worse than cannabis on driving.
Correct.
Those were two focal slides. I'm going to accept that I'm happy with your evidence that you do not abide the description of cannabis being the least harmful recreational drug. I appreciate that concession. But what you omitted to do, and I would be fair to you, you did at one point in your evidence in chief say, well, it's not perfect. It's not a perfect model. I'm going to give that to you. Wouldn't we want to be unfair? But with respect, Professor, you didn't inform His Lordship, at the very least, that this had scientific limitations, or what these criticisms were and what your responses were, to properly inform His Lordship, to be of assistance to him, how to contextualize your model and your evidence. Am I correct?
Well,
I believe I am.
Yes. If I misled anyone, that was not my intention.
When you were sacked by the Home Secretary, and I use the word sacked because that's the word you used, it's colloquial English language from your part of the world, so if you don't like it, you're welcome to ask me to change it.
I won't dispute that.
You criticized the Home Secretary publicly for applying the cautionary principle, correct? Because that was his, appears to be his defense, it was part of his defense in the public debate, that he was being cautious. You criticized the application of the cautionary principle.
Indeed.
Why is it that when a politician is cautious, we criticize him, and when he's not cautious enough, we still criticize him? Generally speaking, with you've criticized politicians.
Well, I wasn't criticizing politicians, I was criticizing the Home Secretary, for using the precautionary principle largely as I believe, a smokescreen to avoid making the right decisions about drugs. And this, I believe, was done for political reasons, not for reasons of health or even reasons of science, but simply to try to bolster their chances of winning the next election.
Really, it was your comments in the media, and in publication in the media, that ultimately placed you at odds with the Home Secretary. You really went head-to-head with the Home Secretary in the media.
Well, I didn't go head-to-head with anyone. I simply told the truth about drugs and drug harms. Unfortunately, at that particular time, politicians weren't interested in the truth about drugs. They were interested in drugs as a way of gaining votes. A few years before, they were interested, but at that particular time, the political pendulum had swung towards a more prohibitionist approach, which I thought was was scientifically dishonest and potentially doing more harm than good.
The Advisory Council is not a spokesperson as such for the government in the United Kingdom. It's an advisory committee.
Correct.
So what gave you a mandate to speak out and criticize them for not following your advice?
Well, it is a scientific committee.
A scientific committee, you say?
The ACMD is a committee which was set up in 1971 to provide the government with the best estimates of the harms of drugs and to develop policy, or to help the government develop policies to minimize those harms. And when the best evidence of the council is that the government's policies are not evidence-based, it's important for scientists, because many of us are scientists on the council, to say that they are failing in their duty to comply with the terms of the Misuse of Drugs Act, which is a statutory act that requires governments, at the very least, to consult with the Advisory Council before making changes in the law.
Professor, I was caught on guard by your wording there. Just give me a minute to find file. You can go to file 13. At page 430. I don't read here that firstly that this is a scientific committee. In fact, at the time that those 16 criteria were developed, I think there were only 10 scientists or 10 persons with a PhD on that committee out of 30. The committee has a minimum of 20 max. Well, then there were 30, correct?
I don't remember.
And only 10 of them held PhDs. Can you dispute that?
I haven't looked, but if you've looked and you know, then
it's in the media, and it was a criticism written up in the media. In fact, I think the author was Mr. David Rains. That's the first point. Secondly, let's read what the committee says of itself here. The Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs is a non-departmental public body that has a statutory duty to advise and to consider any matter referred to them by ministers on drug-related issues in the United Kingdom, on their control, classification and scheduling under the Misuse of Drugs Act and its regulations. I don't read there, neither have I read in any of the other material on this committee, that they are required to provide best estimates, which is wording out of your article and your evidence.
Well, how can you advise without getting the best estimates?
I'm not saying...
And I can assure you that the policy, the development of the scale of harms and the multi-criteria decision approach was authorised under the body of work that I requested to do when I was the chair of the council. It was authorised by the previous Home Secretary, Jackie Smith. So the government were well aware of what we were doing, and they supported it because at some level they do think that the drug law should be based on evidence.
So I come back to my question. Who mandated you to speak on behalf, or to speak in criticism of the government, when in fact you formed part of its process to be advised?
Well, as a scientist, I think my duty is to science. And as a citizen, I think my duty is to other citizens. And if I believe the government is, in effect, worsening the plight of people who use drugs, whether it's alcohol, tobacco, or illegal drugs, by policies which are not evidence-based, I think it's my duty to speak up.
Which capacity do you sit here and speak in these proceedings?
I'm speaking to you here as an expert, I understand.
A scientist or an expert citizen?
I'm speaking to you as an expert scientist, but I'm also, I think, a citizen.
Not of this country, of course.
Not of your country.
Professor, would you turn, well, I trust this file is there. I want to turn to a recent file of documents placed before the court, and this might even be the process of placing it before your lordship. It's known as file 9C, or I think it's 9C. Yeah, there is apparently a 9C in some sort of proximity to your lordship. Professor, can you find 9C in the box of files?
I don't have a 9C.
You don't have a 9C. Maybe we should sort that out over tea, in the tea adjournment, and then return. It's not yet, but maybe I can come back to that, my lord, so that we don't waste time. Professor, I just want to, in completion of my task to properly address some of your issues, take you to 3 documents of organizations that we've referred to. The first is in file 12. if you could go there to page 102. Sorry, I may have made a mistake. If you just bear with me. Sorry, my lord, if you could just stop there. My notes seem to be incorrect for some reason. In the meantime, I'll come back to that. Can we go to file 11, page 751? Are you there, Professor?
I am here.
Could you then go from 751 is a document by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. This is their 2017 edition. This document is the executive summary, conclusions and policy implications. I might just point out to you, which you may or may not have realized, this document is made up of 5 separate documents or booklets. Those are found at the beginning of file 13. This is the executive summary, but we decided afterwards that it's best we include the entire makeup of the document, and so that's why those are found elsewhere a little bit later. It was a subsequent decision. But if we go to page 769, and I felt it's important for me to put this to you as it relates to cannabis, and it is material on which we would be relying on in due course. This talks at page 769 on the right-hand side of the page, cannabis market developments. Most jurisdictions in the United States now permit access to medical cannabis, while 9 allow the cultivation of cannabis for recreational use. I'll read it into the record. The latest voter initiatives in the United States in 2016 allowed the legalization of cannabis for recreational use in an additional 4 states. Recreational use of cannabis is now permitted in 8 states and the District of Columbia. Of greater importance is that in those jurisdictions, with the exception of the District of Columbia, licenses are now granted to for-profit companies to produce and sell a range of products for the medical and non-medical use of cannabis. In the jurisdictions where the recreational use of cannabis is now permitted, cannabis use has increased among the adult population and remains higher than the national average. This trend preceded the change in legislation in those jurisdictions, however. It is difficult to quantify the impact of the new cannabis legislation, as it seems that a combination of elements was already in the process of changing the cannabis use market in those jurisdictions when the legalization measures were put in place. Over the page at 770, the major increase in cannabis use in those jurisdictions started in 2008, in parallel with measures allowing the medical use of cannabis, although the cannabis products dispensed have not gone through the rigors of pharmaceutical product development. Decreasing risk perceptions of harm from cannabis use and an ongoing debate around the legalization of the medical and recreational use of cannabis. Since the approval of legislation measures, the increasing trend in cannabis use in those jurisdictions has continued. Yet, while the increases in those jurisdictions are more marked than in states where such has not been legalized, cannabis use has increased at the national level. The developments observed in the jurisdictions where the use of cannabis has been legalized, including the perception of risk of harm from cannabis use, appeared to have affected the cannabis market and users' perceptions of cannabis nationwide. It has been observed that the increasing cannabis use across the United States are disproportionately associated with adults with a low socioeconomic status who are regular and heavy users of cannabis. Now, much of what I've read there has come up in other discussions out of other papers, Professor. But the point here is that this is the position taken by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. And this is their interpretation of data and information, not just that of a group of American universities or a particular state. Any comment on that?
Well, I would just say that the UNODC has its business is about keeping drugs criminalised, and whatever it does, you have to see it through the lens of an organisation that is paid to continue the drug war and to continue the prohibition of drugs. So, yes, I won't argue that these data might be true. I don't know the original source data, but the UNODC is their interpretations and certainly their policies are, I think, coloured by the fact that they have a perspective which is about criminalising people who use drugs and prohibiting drugs through the war on drugs.
If we could, shall we take the agenda at this stage?
As Your Lordship pleases, I apologise for the delay.
Court adjourns. Mr. Willis.
As your lordship pleases, my lord, there a box has been provided for certain of your files, and I understand that files
Yes, that is not
9
appropriate.
ABC.
But I don't know whose responsibility it is.
If
They should be placed in a more better way than put on a chair here in this manner. Not
I'm only going to be going to file. We'll make sure that that's all. I can answer that question, but I'll. Your lordship didn't see what I saw. I think it was just an effort, my lord, for your lordship's convenience, but I'm only going to refer to one of those files, 9C. I'll get back to that in a moment.
Yes.
Professor, if we could turn to a document I had misplaced in my notes. If you can go to file 10, page 290.
Yes.
This is a document by the World Health Organization on cannabis, titled The Health and Social Effects of Non-Medical Cannabis Use. It's difficult to find, but we have identified this is a 2016 document.
Yes. Yes.
In fact, it's at page 292 for the record. We discovered that. Now, I'd ask you to go to page 336. And at this page, one finds the conclusions to this.
336.
336.
I don't have a 336, I'm afraid.
So you are in file 10, are you?
This is the WHO, the Wayne Hall report, yes?
No, not the Wayne Hall report.
Oh.
Volume 10.
Volume 10?
Oh. Well, I've got file 10, is that?
That should be.
Clearly, is that it? Is this what's the document called?
Page 336 starts off with a heading conclusions.
There's just not there's gaps. I might have it on my computer.
Yeah, there are gaps in here.
Can I just check it? Is it the WHO? It's the WHO report, isn't it?
Yes, yes.
I have it on my computer. That's fine. Where the pages are missing, but I have it on my laptop. Oh, okay.
To be honest, I'd prefer you use the document though, Professor.
Okay, sure. Thank you.
I want to, maybe just, Professor, so you understand why I'm putting this to you, is across the spectrum of evidence you've given, we will be arguing, and fairly vociferously so, that practically everything you've told His Lordship is wrong, for various reasons, and that'll be our task. But I must just take you, we'll be relying on this document in particular, so I must give you an opportunity. I know that you are, in certain respects, at odds, but where you're not at odds with something, are you welcome to interrupt me and say that you do agree.
Okay.
So I have to leave that responsibility with you. So from 9.1.2, what we do know about the epidemiology of cannabis use and cannabis dependence, what do we know about the epidemiology of cannabis use and cannabis dependence? We know the following. Cannabis is the most widely used illicit drug globally. 2013, an estimated 181.8 million people aged 15 to 64 years use cannabis for non-medical purposes globally. Uncertainty estimates 128.5 up to 232.1 million. I alluded to those numbers yesterday, you'll recall.
The only objection I have to that statement is the word illicit, because it clearly isn't illicit for many of those millions of users.
Cannabis use appears to be more common in developed countries than in developing countries, although we lack good data on prevalence of use in the latter, in the developing countries. Any comment? None.
Appears to be, yes.
Next point, young people often use cannabis, with the mid-teens being the age of first use in many developed countries.
Correct.
Next, there has been an upward trend in the mean THC content of all confiscated cannabis preparations in the USA and some European countries.
Well, I suppose if you're looking back over the last 30 years, that is true. Yes.
Cannabis dependence exists and is a cluster of behavioral, cognitive, and physiological phenomena that develop after repeated cannabis use.
In some people, yes.
There are some indications that the prevalence of cannabis dependence increased worldwide between 2001 and 2010.
Some indicators, yes.
I think there are probably more than some, based on the evidence that we've heard from you in relation to usage that we have discussed, more than just some. We looked at. Let's leave that, Professor. Let's not waste time. There is a major demand for addiction treatment systems for cannabis use disorders in many high-income countries and in some low- and middle-income countries.
There is a demand, yes.
What do we know about the short-term effects of cannabis use? We know the following. The most obvious short-term health effect of cannabis is intoxication, marked by disturbances in the level of consciousness, cognition, perception, affect, or behavior, and other psychophysiological functions and responses.
Yes.
Is that a yes?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, Professor, you were drinking water there. That is a yes that I...
Oh, that is correct, yes.
Thank you. A minority of first-time cannabis users become very anxious, have panic attacks, experience hallucinations, and vomit. These symptoms may be sufficiently distressing to prompt affected users to seek medical care.
Correct.
Acute use impairs driving and contributes to an increased risk of traffic injuries.
Correct.
There is some evidence that cannabis use can trigger coronary events. Recent case reports and case series, might be studies, suggest that cannabis smoking may increase CVD risk in younger cannabis smokers who are otherwise at relatively low risk.
Correct.
9.1.4. What do we know about the long-term effects of regular cannabis use? We know the following. Regular cannabis users can develop dependence on the drug. The risk may be around 1 in 10 among those who ever use cannabis, 1 in 6 among adolescent users, and 1 in 3 among daily users.
Correct.
Withdrawal syndrome is well documented in cannabis dependence.
Correct.
Next, over on page 337. Growing evidence reveals that regular, heavy cannabis use during adolescence is associated with more severe and persistent negative outcomes than during adulthood.
Correct.
Next, in a number of prospective studies, there is a consistent dose-response relationship between cannabis use in adolescence and the risk of developing psychotic symptoms or schizophrenia.
Correct for psychotic symptoms.
The association between cannabis use and psychosis or schizophrenia has been recognized for over 2 decades.
Yes.
It then goes on to say in at least 5 ways. Cannabis produces a full range of transient schizophrenia like positive, negative, and cognitive symptoms in some healthy individuals.
Part of that's correct. I think the evidence that it produces negative symptoms is less clear, but certainly positive symptoms and cognitive symptoms, yes.
This is the next of 5. In those harboring a psychotic disorder, cannabis may exacerbate symptoms, trigger relapse, and have negative consequences on the course of the illness.
It may do, yes.
I beg your pardon?
It may do. It is not inevitable, but it may do, yes.
With heavy cannabis use, susceptible individuals in the general population develop a psychotic illness which is associated with age of onset of use, strength of THC in the cannabis, frequency of use, and duration of use.
That is true.
Next, cannabis use is associated with lowering the age of onset of schizophrenia. Sorry, let me reread that. Cannabis use is associated with lowering the age of onset of schizophrenia. It is likely that cannabis exposure is a component cause that interacts with other factors to precipitate schizophrenia or a psychotic disorder, but is neither necessary nor sufficient to do so alone. Maybe just up to there.
That is correct, yes.
It continues, symptoms of schizophrenia increase with cannabis use and strength. The magnitude of the symptoms is associated with the amount used and the frequency of use.
Correct.
And the fifth point, daily use in adolescence and young adulthood is associated with a variety of negative health and psychological outcomes. These include early school leaving. Could I ask you to comment one by one?
Yeah, well, first I need to comment on the associated with, because this mustn't be read as causal, but it is associated with early school leaving, yes.
Cognitive impairment.
Yes, I would, okay, in the general sense, yes.
Increased risk of using other illicit drugs.
Well, I think the evidence is other drugs. I don't like illicit there, but I would say other drugs, yes.
Increased risk of depressive symptoms.
Probably.
Increased rates of suicidal ideation and behavior.
Possibly.
You said cognitive, the second item, cognitive impairment, you used the word generally.
Well, I don't know what, I mean, cognition is a very complex range of psychic phenomena, brain activities. So, I mean, some aspects of cognition can be improved by cannabis, but many can be impaired. So it's not entirely clear what they're talking about, but overall there can be a negative effect on cognition, that is true.
Just bear with me. I'm just looking for the various here. Cognitive impairment would relate to the executive brain functions. Would that be correct?
Well, there's one aspect of it, of cognition, yes.
Those, if I could just go through a list of what those are, for instance, perception of facts, impulsivity, motor coordination, behavioral control, emotional control, learning and working memory, attention span and concentration, ability to plan, organize skills, problem solving, decision making. Those fall into the categories of brain function and cognitive impairment. That's what would be impaired, those sort of functions.
Well, some of them, yeah. I mean, they're not all cognitive, but there's no point in splitting hairs here. It can have a negative effect on brain function, yes.
Thank you. Professor, I just want to move to the topic of marijuana as a medicine. I want to ask you if you agree that when assessing a medicine, one looks at the following 5 factors. The drug's chemistry must be known and reproducible. Is that a requirement for a medicine?
Nope.
There must be adequate safety studies.
Yes.
There must be adequate and well-controlled studies proving efficacy.
I think what we are talking about here, are you talking about marketing a medicine or prescribing a drug?
There's the requirements to be termed a medicine.
So these are requirements by what, the South African medical authorities.
Well, these are points I'm putting to you for your comment on wherever they might come from.
So, okay, so there should be safety. There should be
Well, the first one was the chemistry must be known and reproducible. The second is that there must be adequate safety studies. Thirdly, there must be adequate and well-controlled studies proving efficacy.
Go on.
Do you agree with the efficacy condition standard?
There must be evidence of efficacy. Yes.
Evidence. But these are, the focus is adequate and well-controlled studies proving efficacy. Obviously, evidence proves.
Well, ideally, but I don't know that that is an absolute requirement for the use of a medicine. No. There should be an agreement between the doctor and the patient that this might be of benefit to them. The decision is not determined by external authorities, except where it comes to paying for it, I suppose.
The drug must be accepted by well-qualified experts.
Ideally, yes, but we mustn't stop innovation.
And scientific evidence must be widely available concerning what is to be called the medication. In other words, there must have been objective clinical trials, which are obviously then published.
No, not necessarily. No, that's a modern interpretation of what we need to do to make medicines. But many, in fact, all medicines, traditional medicines, would probably fall foul of all those, but that doesn't mean they're not medicines.
Could you look around you for file 9C, my Lord? I trust that is close to hand for your Lordship.
Are these bits?
No, they're not those yet, Professor. This is in a fixed file.
9C.
Sorry. Apparently it's a batch of new files, my Lord, that maybe your registrar might assist us. Professor, these documents that I'm going to take you to now come out of the documents which the first 7 defendants have placed before court in the last 48 hours or so. Or in fact, a little bit longer. I think it was over the weekend already. Be that as it may, I accept you might not have had an opportunity to look at many of these. Is that correct?
Well, I read the book.
Let's start. I'd like to take you for a start to page 1873.
Yes.
Are you familiar with this article in relation to Canada? I'm not going to trick you into any questions and take you in any depth into the document. Professor, I really want to put a statement in the document to you. So are you familiar with it?
I believe I have read it, yes.
The last paragraph is what's applicable here. The government appears to be hastening, and this is the Canadian government, the government appears to be hastening to deliver on a campaign promise without being careful enough about the health impacts of policy. It's not good enough to say that provinces and territories can set more stringent rules if they wish. If Parliament truly cares about the public health and safety of Canadians, especially our youth, then they go on to opine, this bill will not pass. The focus is public health, safety of Canadians, and especially our youth. You agree that all three of those are applicable in all societies in the consideration of either policy or legislation?
So which line are we at now with the three?
It's the last paragraph, bottom of that page, Professor. Page
Public health,
1873.
safety of Canadians, especially our youth. This bill would not pass.
So it's public health, safety of citizens, and especially the youth, are determinants for policy and legislation, proposed legislation.
Well, this is I guess a warning to the government to think these things through carefully. Of course, they should do that. Public health is important, safety of Canadians is important, and the safety of youth is particularly important. And those have to be part of the equation in making a decision about changing the law.
If you turn to page, just bear with me, 1875, this is medical marijuana is the case, is the cart before the horse. Would this be an article you've read?
Yes, I have read it, yes.
At the top of the column on the right-hand side of this page,
yes,
it says, dealing with this from the FDA's perspective, this, unlike most FDA-approved drugs, they typically have one or two active constituents. Marijuana is a complex of more than 400 compounds, including flavonoids, terpenoids, and approximately 70 cannabinoids, other than THC. If you turn over the page, that's just by way of introduction, and the comparison there obviously is the normally one or two active constituents, where here we have a complex plant. If you go to page 1876, various points are traversed, and on the left-hand side of page 1876, one-third of the printed section, two-thirds of the printed section down, near footnote 13, starts the word collectively. Have you found that?
Yes.
I'll read from there. Collectively, these changes in the endocannabinoidal system have been linked to effective behavioral, cognitive, and neurochemical consequences that last into adulthood. Data on the effects of repeated exposure to marijuana amongst youth must necessarily rely on epidemiological studies, which thus far support the animal data in demonstrating long-term consequences, including cognitive deficits and increased risk of psychosis. Careful consideration is needed to determine at what age exposure to medical marijuana is justifiable because of the following factors: brain development and continued age continues until age 25 years. There's some debate about that, Professor. Some say 21. There's even some as high as 28. They pitch it at 25 years here. The endocannabinoid system is involved in brain development, and 3, cannabinoid exposure during critical periods of brain development is associated with long-lasting changes in behavior and cognition. You agree with that, if I understand your evidence?
No, there's no evidence in humans that that's true at all, no.
But they've qualified that.
Okay.
Yes.
There's no evidence yet. I mean, it might well be. It might. I mean,
Well, there's no direct scientific evidence because they haven't conducted the research on humans, but there's every indicator, is there not?
I wouldn't say there's every indicator, no. I mean,
Would you say there are indicators?
there are indicators that. Well, not sure brain. It depends. I think you must. It's very important to dissociate the effects of cannabis from the effects of cannabis on the brain development. No one, in all these hundreds of papers that you have put before me, no one has shown, and even Murray himself says quite clearly, there is no evidence it changes the brain other than it produces changes in cognition or changes in perception, but it doesn't change the brain morphology. So think we have to separate the evidence that cannabis use ever harms the brain in terms of its structure is not there. In fact, you can argue it might even benefit the brain in some ways.
We'll leave that for evidence. If you now go down page 1876, there is the words "in conclusion," slightly indented.
Yes.
And this is the point the article makes, of course. In conclusion, if the state's initiative to legalize medical marijuana is merely a veiled step toward allowing access to recreational marijuana, then the medical community should be left out of the process, and instead marijuana should be decriminalized. Do you have any comments on that statement?
Well, I would certainly favour decriminalisation of personal use, yes.
But do you agree with the statement that the medical community should be left out then?
No, the medical community needs to have some say in how potential changes, increases in use and harms might be dealt with or minimised. So I don't think it's medically... If you believe cannabis is harmful, and we've all established that it is to some extent, then some of those harms will clearly be in the province of doctors. Therefore,
Professor, let's read it again. In conclusion, if the state's initiative to legalize medical marijuana is merely a veiled step toward allowing access to recreational marijuana, then the medical community should be left out of the process, and instead marijuana should be decriminalized. If I understood your evidence, even if the legalization of medical marijuana is merely a veiled step towards allowing access to recognized or to recreational marijuana, you are happy to be involved in that process as part of the medical fraternity?
I suppose if it was veiled, no one would know it was happening. But if it was an explicit step, then I think that obviously doctors should be involved in helping politicians come to the right decision, because health consequences are of some relevance in terms of making that decision.
It continues, conversely, if the goal is to make marijuana available for medical purposes, then it is unclear why the approval process should be different from that used for other medications.
Well, it may be unclear to them, but it's pretty obvious to me, and I've said it several times, and it's because there are so many different components in the plant that it would take, well, I think it would take centuries to fully evaluate all the different components in the different combinations in non-plant material in order to know if any of them were efficacious. That will never happen. It will never happen for these reasons, because there are so many indications. Most of the indications are of little interest to pharmaceutical companies, so they will not do the research. The research would cost hundreds of billions of pounds to do, and would take centuries to come to fruition. So in the interim, you're denying people who might benefit access to what has been and still is in some countries a medicine. This is an arbitrary Americocentric view of what a medicine is, and this cannot be applied around the world, and it certainly shouldn't be applied to countries that don't have the same wealth as America in terms of developing medicines. And beyond that, I would say one other thing, my lord. There is almost no research now anywhere in the world into new treatments for brain disorders. Most companies have given up because it's difficult and challenging, and as I said the other day, it usually costs over $1 billion. In fact, I looked at more recent data. The Rutgers School estimate $2.3 billion to take a drug on the market. That is, and it's the failure rate in brain disorders is higher than in other disorders, so there's almost no research going on to find new treatments for brain disorders. If we insist that cannabis and its component parts have to go through that process, it will never happen. It won't. I can guarantee that.
And so, Professor, as I understand your evidence, the scientific community should simply rely on estimates and experiment with society at large.
No, what we should do is very, very straightforward. We should make sure that when cannabis is used as a medicine, we document the symptoms and the outcomes of as many people as possible, and we gather the data that way rather than the other way, this current monolithic way of doing what the FDA requires. And remind you again, this development of drugs, according to this methodology, is about allowing people to sell drugs. It's not about allowing doctors to prescribe drugs. It's about selling. It's making sure that what's sold is safe and effective. But most indications that doctors have to, for many of the indications, there aren't drugs. Doctors have to use their best judgment as to what's useful. And there will never be trials in many of the possible indications of cannabis by the pharmaceutical companies. So what we need is a progressive system where doctors monitor, as they always have done, the benefits, the risks of prescribing, and that is fed back into a data collection system. So eventually, over the next 20, 30 years, we can build up a body of knowledge about the health benefits. And if it's not beneficial in some disorders, we can then tell doctors not to use it.
If you go to page 1877, please.
Pardon me?
1877.
Yes.
We return to Wayne Hall out of Australia. But this article is written in conjunction not only by his University of Queensland, but the National Addiction Centre, King's College London, and the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre in Australia.
Yes.
I'm going to read from this abstract again. Their aim was to examine changes in the evidence on the health effects of cannabis since 1993. Their method was a comparison of the evidence in 1993 with the evidence and interpretation of the same health outcomes in 2013, 10 years later. The result was that research in the past 20 years has shown that driving while cannabis impaired approximately doubles car crash risk, and that around 1 in 10 regular cannabis users develops dependence. Regular cannabis use in adolescence approximately doubles the risk of early school leaving and of cognitive impairment and psychosis in adulthood. Regular cannabis use in adolescence is also associated strongly with the use of other illicit drugs. We'll put drugs there for you, Professor. These associations persist after controlling for plausible confounding variables in longitudinal studies. This suggests that cannabis use is a contributing cause of these outcomes, but some researchers still argue that these relationships are explained by shared causes or risk factors. Cannabis smoking probably increases cardiovascular disease risk in middle-aged adults, but its effects on respiratory function and respiratory cancer remain unclear because most cannabis smokers have smoked or still smoke tobacco. And I think much of that bears out what we have debated in examination over the last number of days. But the conclusion is this. The epidemiological literature in the past 20 years shows that cannabis users increase the risk of accidents and can produce dependence, and that there are consistent associations, Professor, between regular cannabis use and poor psychosocial outcomes and mental health in adulthood. That's a recent study.
This is the basis of the WHO report he wrote. Yes.
I could ask you to go to 1894. In this article, titled, it's again an Elsevier article, you're aware of this?
Yes.
It's a 2011 article, Medical Marijuana Laws in 50 States, investigating the relationship between state legalization of medical marijuana and marijuana use, abuse, and dependence. I want to take you to one of the concluding comments on page 1898. And if we go to the left-hand column on page 1898, it's approximately the second paragraph on the page. This study highlights, you see those words?
I do.
This study highlights the key role that macro-level factors such as policy changes and community norms about substance use play in shaping marijuana use and abuse dependence, the very point that Rolls and Misha make. Future studies are also needed on the consequences of increased marijuana use, such as accidents, aggression, school dropout, psychosis, HIV, and sexually transmitted disease rates, as well as on the particular impact of medical marijuana legalization on youth, who bear a disproportionate burden of marijuana-related disorders, and the vulnerable to the advertising effects of other substances such as tobacco. Do you agree with that statement?
Yeah, I do. As I have said many times, it's definitely preferable that young people don't use any drug.
Well, but do you agree with that statement, which focuses on the need for studies? Because I'm not sure you've said that many times.
Well, no, I would say that whatever happens in terms of policy in this country or other countries, we must always do very careful follow-up to make sure that there aren't unexpected perverse consequences.
If you can go to page 1900. This is an article titled U.S. Adult Illicit Cannabis Use Disorder and Medical Marijuana Laws. Have you seen this article before?
I have.
If you can go to page 1907. I just want to read from the conclusion. This study suggests that MML, those are medical marijuana laws, as you know, contributed to increasing U.S. adult illicit cannabis use and cannabis disorders. Policy and clinical professionals should recognize that cannabis disorders can be severe. Treatment needs are increasing and treatment can be effective. Medical marijuana laws may benefit some with medical problems. However, changing state laws, medical or recreational, may also have adverse public health consequences. A prudent interpretation of our results is that professionals and the public should be educated on risks of cannabis use and benefits of treatment, and preventing intervention services for cannabis disorders should be provided. Do you agree with the conclusion as to the cause and effect of medical marijuana laws?
To some extent, but I would qualify her conclusion by the observation she makes that the prevalence of marijuana use disorder amongst people who previously used marijuana went down rather than went up. So that clearly the impact of marijuana use varies depending on whether you've not used before or whether you have used. So I don't think you can say it's a univariate relationship between legalization and a negative impact on cannabis use disorders. Would you like me to find that for you?
You've repeatedly today disavowed the use, for your purpose, of the word illicit cannabis.
Yes.
Could you briefly just remind me why you say so?
Well, because it implies some attribute of the drug which may or may not be relevant to the discussions about its harms.
Such as which attribute?
The fact that you can be, in some countries, executed for possessing it.
But that's not an attribute of the drug. That's a consequence.
It's an
of the law.
attribute of the word illicit. That is the point.
We once before substituted the word illegal for illicit.
Well, the reason people use I don't know why people use illicit. I don't know that there's any need to use illegal or illicit when you're talking about a drug, because of course, clearly, cannabis is not illicit in some countries or illegal, certainly legal in some states. So the use of this term illicit is usually, I believe, driven by a desire to make the research sound more important and perhaps to get availability of funding from organisations that like to keep drugs illegal.
You obviously appreciate that cannabis remains prohibited almost the world over. In some jurisdictions it is tolerated or regulated. It remains illegal. Even though it's decriminalized in some jurisdictions, it remains prohibited and illegal unless it's used in accordance with those rules and regulations.
Well, same is true of alcohol. But no one talks about alcohol. Yeah, the point is, every drug, possibly with the exception of caffeine, and even caffeine is regulated to some extent, is regulated. So the illicit word
not in this country. We drink as much as we like.
But I'm not sure that Starbucks is allowed to dispense you a gram a time. I think they can only dispense 90 milligrams. But anyway,
I don't know. Don't know about Starbucks. The next article I'd like you to go to is 1923. This is the role of cannabis in cardiovascular disorders. If you can turn with me to page 1931. This is out of the Journal of Thoracic Disease. The conclusion is as follows. The fact that cannabis use has become increasingly popular among youngsters is a major cause for concern. It is important to consider a negative impact of cannabis abuse on education, as well as the risk of abuse of other illicit drugs among the youth on the development of psychosis. Currently, there is a lack of consensus on what position to adopt regarding the legalization of cannabis. While one view regards recreational cannabis uses as harmless, the opposing view is that it raises some serious public health concerns and that its use should continue to be discouraged by governing bodies and prohibited by law. Over the page, the literature suggests the occurrence of harmful effects, including fatal cardiovascular events, that could be related to cannabis use. Further research and studies are needed to determine the impact of acute and especially the chronic regular use of cannabis on various organ systems, particularly the cardiovascular system. Just so far for now, you're not an expert on other organs, much beyond the brain.
I don't think these people are experts on the brain. I mean, it's quite remarkable, isn't it, how cardiologists, interestingly, from a state, Georgia...
Did I finish the question?
Oh, sorry. Go on.
You're not an expert on the cardiovascular system and the organs, and you're not a thoracic expert. You're somebody who is an expert in the realm of drugs working on the brain and whatever else you have told us. Their opinion is that further research and studies are needed to determine the impact of acute and especially the chronic regular use of cannabis on various organ systems, particularly the cardiovascular system. Your comment on that?
Well, I will repeat what I've said many times. More research is very important. It is interesting. We don't really have a good idea why cannabis affects the cardiovascular system. It doesn't seem to be contributing a great deal to cardiac mortality, certainly a lot less than alcohol and tobacco. But yes, of course we should monitor it, and of course we should do our best to minimize people's coming to harm for using it. And doctors who prescribe it should be monitoring that too. It's important.
Just to complete for your benefit mostly, the conclusion, with the recent decriminalization and legalization of cannabis used in some parts of the world and the increase in the number of conditions that cannabis can be prescribed for, there is a good possibility that physicians will encounter more cases of cardiovascular and cerebrovascular complications of cannabis use in the near future. It is necessary to increase awareness among physicians and the general public alike regarding the increased risk of cardiovascular complications associated with cannabis use. In addition, implementing the effective strategies for the prudent dispersal of the drug is necessary to avoid unnecessary increases in cannabis-related complications and therefore preclude the resultant burden on public and private health services. The current evidences highlight the urgent need for a change in the mindset among cannabis users, particularly the young, regarding the adverse effects of cannabis use and the risk of acute coronary events, stroke and possible death. I think there are two main points that are made. The first is that with increased use of cannabis, there is this risk of increased incidence of cardiovascular complications. The second is, if that's the case, one of course needs to properly educate cannabis users on the dangers. Do you agree with the paragraph
Yes.
in my summation?
I undoubtedly in favour of educating and educating doctors, educating users. I would also draw your notice to the top of the page where they list some of the positive effects of cannabis on the cardiovascular system too. So it's very important, one doesn't see just the negatives when one's thinking about a drug.
Is that, those be that one doesn't need to exercise to get the heart rate up?
Well, yes, I don't think it was heart rate. I think it was weight circumference, modulation of reducing cardiovascular disease risk factors, reduction in tobacco smoking, lower prevalence of obesity, lower fasting insulin, and smaller waist circumference, protection against ischemic insults to the heart. So cannabis does have benefits to the heart as well as disbenefits, and that the doctors need to know both, and that's where the future will come.
Well, I'm not accepting what you say in the first part, but I'm in agreement with you that doctors need to know both. So we can agree on that. Thank you. Then, my Lord, there are 3 further documents I want to just hand to your Lordship. My Lord, these 3 documents, as well as some documents yesterday, as well as the overstacking of one of those files, is something that will be sorted out in due course, my Lord. What will transpire is when your Lordship's finished with these documents, no doubt they'll be taken up to your chambers at the end of the matter, my Lord, of this portion, this period, and then the plaintiff's personnel will make sure it's sorted out in accordance with an index. Yes. So if your Lordship could bear with the my Lord, these 3 items were handed to Professor.
Are you able to say at this stage in which volume
they're all at this stage? They can all just be stacked at the back of file 13. They will be probably converted into file 14 in due course. But if you could just, we would reference. I'm going to reference them.
So you've referenced them as F13.
Yes, currently as 13.
Yes, because I make notes on the basis of the numbers.
Yes, that's
the documents
true.
And which
My Lord, these are going to go into.
If they are later put in another volume, it would mean I'd have to now go.
Yes,
and look around.
My Lord, these are going to go into 14. And I think we should undertake to give your Lordship a list of documents separate to the index that were referenced 13 and are now referenced 14.
So then where you say here F13, should that now be 14?
I would say change that to 14, my Lord.
Just for completeness, might I just point out, as I have it, my Lord, on 2 of the documents, or all 3 documents seem to have been paginated. On 2 of them, the pagination is correct. On the 3rd, the largest, the most voluminous of the 3,
yes.
That pagination doesn't seem to be correct. So I'm just concerned about, for the purposes of the record, if we're now going to be referring to pages and they're then going to change.
Yes, no, that would not be appropriate.
My Lord, these I think will be, well, these are the last documents that are going to be handed in relation to our documents at this juncture. Your Lordship, the document that has 631 at the top of it as a paginated number, it's from there onwards that document will in fact, your Lordship can write there, if your Lordship, with the number 564, they're going to continue from there. Obviously, that we must fix up, my Lord.
Referring to the 3rd bundle.
Yes, the one that has 631 at the top. That won't remain as 631.
It's going to be?
That will start 564, and then we will fix up the numbering thereafter, my Lord. Yeah, that's fine. I don't intend to go into any detail in these documents, but in all fairness, these are very recent documents, my Lord. Professor, these 3 items, you were handed copies earlier. The first has the number 547 at the top. This is I just want to draw your attention to all this is really the head note. That's all we could access in relation to this. But specifically, you testified, and I understood you to be saying that you had personal experience in the treating of chronic pain and PTSD.
Yes.
With cannabis.
No.
Not.
No, because it's not a medicine in my country.
I see. Sorry, then I misunderstood your evidence. However, you expressed the opinion then that PTSD and chronic pain are treatable. The symptoms are treatable.
Indeed.
This article, which we found is a very recent article, in fact this month, evidence lacking of the benefits of cannabis for treating chronic pain and PTSD. This is by one Kelly Young, edited by the other persons.
Which one are you referring to now?
The document with 547 at the top right-hand corner.
Evidence lacking.
Yes, evidence lacking. Are there other articles such as this more recently?
On PTSD?
Of this nature, that there's evidence lacking? Are you aware of other articles?
No, just the ones you've provided today. Well, this one, it's all the same articles.
Yes, then the other two documents, if we turn to the one with the number 548 in the right-hand top corner. This one deals with benefits and harms of plant-based cannabis for post-traumatic stress disorder, a systematic review. And if you go over the page to 549, the conclusion there is drawn that evidence is insufficient to draw conclusions about the benefits and harms of plant-based cannabis preparations in patients with PTSD, but several ongoing studies may provide some important results. Do you agree with that conclusion?
Well,
in your estimation, not how they arrive at that conclusion, but in your estimation, do you agree with that?
So the question is, insufficient to draw conclusions. Yes, well, I agree. We can't conclude that the benefits outweigh the harms, but there's definitely adequate suggestion of benefit to warrant doing more studies. Absolutely.
And then if we go to the third document, which will in future for the record bear the number 564, this one equally, it's very recent. It's the 15th of August. I know I handed it to you earlier, but I don't think it would be fair to describe that as familiarity with the document. So I'm not going to do more than what I did with the previous one and take you to the conclusion on the next page. 632. Limited evidence suggests that cannabis may alleviate neuropathic pain in some patients, but insufficient evidence exists for other types of chronic pain. Among general populations, limited evidence suggests that cannabis is associated with an increased risk for adverse mental health effects. You can't disagree with that, can you?
No, but I do find it interesting, and the weakness of this paper, which I have read, and the other one is that, and the cardiovascular one, is that what we know about the problems of cannabis come from recreational use. But the inference in these papers is that therapeutic use will present the same problems. And there is, to my knowledge, very little evidence that that is the case. And I think we're fairly certain with drugs like Sativex, you don't see evidence of dependence and the development of tolerance and increased usage. So I think you cannot assume that the patient population will respond in the same negative way as the people who use it recreationally. And I think it's disturbing that doctors continually merge those two separate issues.
No, what is disturbing, Professor, is in your answer you compare Sativex. Because, and I do believe I put this to you some days back, Sativex contains only 1/10 THC compared with current THC content of marijuana. It's a limited dose controlled dose of THC in Sativex.
Yeah, but they can take it 3 times a day, so that you can get up to 10 milligrams or more a day.
That's abuse. That's not medical use.
No, I think Sativex can be used several times a day. That's my recollection.
I thought you were criticizing the use of it. Well, it's
no, I'm just
still
saying,
then controlled.
It is very important. You must not assume that the impact of cannabis used medicinally, presumably in a regulated way, monitored by doctors, will produce the same side effects as cannabis used in a recreational way in 12-year-olds. I mean, that would be absurd, because our experience tells us that people who use drugs to deal with symptoms don't abuse them generally.
The point I make is that there's no comparison between Sativex.
No, I was only saying that Sativex is an example, because we don't have
cannabis.
We don't really. Well, these people don't have examples. The fact that they have to say on page, which will be page 565, they don't bring up any evidence of side effects in the patient population, so they have to then go and say, but be wary. General populations have limited evidence that there's a risk of adverse mental. You know, this is eliding from the medical arena into the recreational arena. And I suppose you could be generous and say, well, they're saying to doctors, be aware that these problems occur in the non-medical arena. But they, you know, it's sometimes I wonder whether they're trying to exaggerate or the risk or minimise people's confidence in at least trying out this medication.
Professor, yesterday morning there was a document that was handed to you. It's the one that deals with your standard joint unit.
Yes.
Its reference, my Lord, I must hand a copy to your Lordship. Lordship, bear with me. Where's the judge's copy? My Lord, my junior tells me there was an attempt to place it before your Lordship earlier, I think, so.
Which one is that?
Let me make clear, my Lord. Apparently, when the documents were handed up earlier, my Lord, there were 4. One of them has, I think it's best to first describe the document, the standard joint unit on it, my Lord. It's a single page item.
Was given a page number.
It has a number 546.
The ones that were handed up now?
Yes, apparently there were 4.
Yes,
you have it in front of you. Now, Professor, you'll recall 2 or so days ago, you and I traversed information about THC content, your preferred content, or maximum, I think, 4%, you said?
No, I think
No, answer my question, please. Was that what I understood you to say, that your preferred content was no more than 4%? Uruguay was 2% as a THC content?
If I was opening up a regulated market, what strength would I sell? Yeah, I think 4% would be a reasonable.
That is what I recall you saying. Uruguay was 2%. What I found strange was then subsequently found this article, in which you were the author, one of the authors in this.
Yeah.
Let me read the abstract into the record. And for the record, this will be, my Lord, also in file 14, ultimately at 546.
Yes.
The abstract reads, reliable data on cannabis quantities is required to improve assessment of cannabis consumption for epidemiological analysis and clinical assessment. Consequently, a standard joint unit based on quantity of, and that's THC, has been established. Is that, it says based on has been established, is it this article that you were saying established that standard?
That is what we were attempting to do, yes.
Yes, so this article was that attempt. It had not been established before. And then you're here, so I don't need to read through it, but what it appears you did was you took samples in a year, no, more than a year period, February 15 to June 2016, universities, leisure spaces, mental health services, and cannabis clubs in Barcelona.
Yes.
Adults reported use in the last 60 days without cognitive impairment or language barriers. Answered a questionnaire on cannabis use and were asked to donate a joint to further determine their THC and cannabidiol content. There were 492 participants who donated 315 valid joints. Just out of interest, what was a valid joint that a complete cannabis cigarette?
Maybe they fell apart or they couldn't be put into the testing machine or something.
You didn't participate in the actual collection then?
No, I did not.
And donators were on average 29 years and older. And they go through that, there's quite a bit of detail. The conclusion is that consistent 9 THC content in joints lead to a standard joint unit of 7 milligrams. The integer number closest to the median value shared by both cannabis types. Independently, if marijuana or hashish, I'm not too sure how to understand this, but it then starts 1 standard joint unit equals 1 joint, equals 0.25 grams of cannabis equals 7 milligrams of THC.
Yes.
So I just want to make sure I understand this correctly. This is what you have now determined to be a standard joint unit for your purposes, internationally speaking.
Well, this is what we have determined is the median amount of THC in joints which are used by people in Spain. Now, this paper has, as you see, just recently been published. So what we will be interested in knowing is what the rest of the world thinks. It's critically important that we gather information on the use of cannabis based on something more than just how many joints are smoked. When we gather alcohol data, we gather data on either on the grams of alcohol consumed per day or the volume, the mils of alcohol consumed per day of absolute alcohol. So those are standardized. With tobacco, we usually do it on cigarettes smoked because cigarettes are largely the same. But we don't have any way of collecting that data for cannabis. So what we tried to do here was begin working towards some kind of measure which people might accept internationally. And then you could say, well, if someone's smoking a joint which is twice as strong, that's 2 joint units. And then you could build up over the use over months or years or lifetimes, just exactly how many joint units someone used in the same. And that would give us very more powerful data on the harms and the benefits of cannabis.
Now, I must understand, this is only for Spain.
Just Barcelona, yes.
Very well. Your standard joint unit would preferably have 4 milligrams of THC in it.
No. I think
your preferred joint unit.
No, when we discussed it yesterday, or whenever it was, days ago, no, we were talking about the difference between concentration and amount. And in the early interchange, I put to you the proposition that a 10 milligram joint smoked twice a week, up to 2 of them, up to 3 times a week, would probably be what you could consider as a sort of threshold for safety in comparison with the standard drinking units. Because you put to me what would be the equivalent for cannabis of, say, 4 units for a woman or whatever. I can't remember what you said, but that was what I said. So,
I just found it strange you didn't mention this article to us, but I've taken you there now.
To be honest with you, my lord, I didn't actually know it had been published yet.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Professor. Professor, moving on, in an attempt to make a dash for the finish line, you'll be pleased to know, I'd like to put some statements to you and just elicit your response. Drug use, legal or illegal, and consequent total harm is driven by national and local culture. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would agree with that.
The drugs using culture is affected, for better or worse, by external factors, particularly the actions of and signals given out by government and media.
Yes.
Internationally and domestically, there is a very well-financed, well-orchestrated, planned campaign to normalize and legalize currently illegal drugs and to undermine UN conventions.
No, I wouldn't agree with that.
You wouldn't agree with that? You familiar with Mr. George Soros?
No.
You're not? You're not familiar with Mr. George Soros?
I've never met him, no. Is it?
Do you not know?
I know who he is.
Are you disavowing knowledge of Mr. George Soros?
Well, I've never met him, but I know who he is, yes.
I didn't ask if you're acquainted to him. I asked if you're familiar with him.
Familiar, I'm aware of him, yes.
You're familiar with, you on more than one occasion identified certain people to be associated with Transform.
Yes, Steve Rolls, yes.
Yes, you mentioned Steve Rolls. Transform is an organisation associated through Mr. Ethan Nadelman with George Soros. In fact, you were in contact with Mr. Nadelman just 2 weekends ago.
Yes, I'm not
at
sure
the convention held in Johannesburg.
It may well be that Nadelman's funded by Soros, I don't know.
Professor, I find it very strange that you make that statement in the context of your evidence before this court. Mr. Ethan Nadelman has often been described as the drug pointman, Mr. George Soros' pointman. It's openly known, one can see this all over the internet. He's funded by Mr. Soros. Transform is funded by Mr. Soros. Mr. Soros, we know, is the progenitor of the Free Society movement, who would like to see all drugs legalized and open to use, an ideology which he openly
Well, then
propagates.
I disagree with him.
You disagree with him? The United Nations Drug Conventions, which are the best-kept international agreements of all time, create a shared responsibility upon states not to undermine the efforts of other states in dealing with threats to society and the rights of the child. Do you agree with that?
You better disambiguate that sentence, because...
I'll read, should I read it again, just in fairness?
Well, it contains two potentially contradictory statements.
Which are?
You have to read it, please.
The United Nations Drugs Conventions, the best-kept international agreements of all time.
I have no idea if that's true.
Very well. So that's a plea of no knowledge. Create a shared
However, I would be delighted to see evidence.
Create a shared responsibility upon states not to undermine the efforts of other states in dealing with threats to society and the rights of the child.
Well, that may be true.
Thank you. A further statement is that surely, Professor, the evidence of harms and effects of, or the destructive effects of cannabis use must surely trump a lack of scientific research. Ultimately.
Could you just say that again?
Yeah.
So, indeed, my Lord, the evidence of harms and the destructive effects of cannabis use must ultimately trump any lack of scientific evidence and research.
In what regard?
Well, across the spectrum, your evidence has been very often, well, there's no evidence of that, no scientific evidence or no researched evidence, particularly on humans. But of course you have conceded that there are all of these other observations and causal, not causal, associations, as you prefer to debate the subject.
I've made myself clear on many occasions that cannabis is not harmless. My view is that those harms are exaggerated by prohibition. I've shown you the beginnings of an analysis that supports that. I also have made it very clear that prohibition has been the major reason why we don't have good data on the medical use of marijuana, because the prohibition effectively precludes research. So I don't think I can say more, to be honest.
Can I ask you to turn now back to file number 2 and to your expert summary, particular, I'd like you to go to page 140.
Yes?
Just for some context, that's where we left off at one stage. Drugs generally in the scale of harms,
Yes.
that together with your model fits into your opinion around the harms or lack thereof. I think we've covered more than enough there. Then at 144, you deal with the effect of prohibitory laws on scientific research.
Yes.
I didn't understand that to be an opinion. I understood that to be a ground. In other words, really a harm to prohibition, or should we see that as a separate opinion?
So it's a harm to science.
Harm to science.
Yes.
I found it difficult to position, but by way of its numbering, I thought it fitted more correctly within your scale of harms debate of sorts. But it's not a separate opinion. That's really my point. I asked you for three. I asked you yesterday about your opinions you came to give, and you gave me three. This was not one of them. So I took it as a ground.
I believe it was. I believe I said harms impediment to research.
Let me just remind you, and then we can just attempt to agree. Your three opinions yesterday were in relation to the harms of cannabis, potential medical use, and then the ways in which cannabis can be regulated. Those were your three opinions you gave me. Maybe it could be in relation to a side point in relation to the potential medical use of cannabis. I don't know.
Well, that's right. That's the whole point I'm making, is that there's so little medical research on medical cannabis because it's illegal. And the USA, for the last 50 years, have insisted that the only research can be conducted by cigarettes that are made by them in Mississippi, and only 4 hospitals in the country have a license to do cannabis research. So none is done, and that's why we continue to labour under this pole of ignorance about this potential.
So when I put to you yesterday, 2.1.1, cannabis, quite possibly the world's oldest medication, and it's inconceivable that it remains illegal, and then 2.1.2 with your 17 subpoints, I asked you really if that was your case or your opinion, and the substance to that opinion for that opinion. You said yes. That's why I didn't know where to place this. But you've told us where to place that. We'll augment those paragraphs with the effect of prohibitory drug laws on scientific research. Where I want to take you to, having clarified that, is page 146. We can just attempt to do this methodically. 2.4.1, given inter alia all of the above, in respect to the first and second plaintiffs and people similarly placed. And then I want to return to precisely what you say there and deal first, though, with in respect to the third plaintiff and people similarly placed. You have not, as I understand from your evidence, you have not examined the third plaintiff. In fact, I don't think you've even met him.
I certainly have not. No.
Yes, I wouldn't know him. I haven't seen him in court either. This says, moreover, cannabis. Well, you speak in relation to him. You have not examined him, but you say, moreover, cannabis is a medicinally beneficial substance that can be used for the treatment of a variety of medical conditions and ailments. We must understand that to be symptoms of conditions, in your opinion. Firstly.
Well, some medical conditions are symptoms. Insomnia, pain, those are symptoms, not conditions. So, in that sense, some of them, the treatments are of symptoms. But I think you could say that they can be conditions. So insomnia can be a condition and a symptom. So Yeah, I
Is it
don't
not
quite see the issue here.
Is not a more appropriate word for treatment alleviation?
Well, alleviation is one of the preferred outcomes of treatment, yes.
The second point is taken up elsewhere. And the third, 2.4.1.5, is not even an opinion for you to express, so I'm not even going to go there. So if we are to then consider the construction of your opinion and of your evidence, your summary of evidence, then in respect of the third plaintiff resorts under your opinion in relation to the medicinal value of cannabis. Would that be correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Because that's not the case for the first and second plaintiffs, as I understand
Correct.
the structure of your
Correct. No,
summary.
Correct.
(2.4.1.1) in relation to the first and second plaintiffs, you opine there, or am I to associate what you say in these paragraphs as part of your opinion? Let's read it for your benefit. The expert does not consider it a rational application of the law to continue to criminalize the use and possession of cannabis, whilst allowing people to use and possess more harmful substances such as tobacco and alcohol. You go on to say, the harms of cannabis, which are relatively minor, are far outweighed by the detrimental effects of criminal prohibition.
I believe.
Now, where does that resort? Does that resort under harms of cannabis?
Yes, I think it, as I've said before, I think it's the decision to punish people for using recreational cannabis is not one that can be rationally based on the harms of the drug. It has to be based on some other principle, moral, religious, political, economic, but it's not rational when you look at the harms that the drug does.
Did I understand you to say that it must, when you say based on religious?
Well, there must be some other rationale for banning cannabis, because it cannot be banned based on its harms. I don't know what the rationale is. I suspect in my country it's political. Maybe in some countries it's religious, we know that. In other countries it may be economic. I don't know. I mean, you have to make, and in South Africa I suspect at least it started off having something to do with economics, and you're hearing that from the historian.
My Lord, I'm right at the end. But I think maybe we should just take the lunchtime adjournment, and I will be very short after lunch and hand over to my learned friend. As your Lordship, please.
The court adjourns.